us again today. I know it's been a few weeks since we've done this. Again, we have Abby Roth with us, and we're going to be talking about SOPs. But before we start, I wanted to announce to everybody that we have gone live in terms of registrations for our upcoming event, the RX Influencer Salon. I'm very excited about this because it's going to be our first live person event. It is October 24th and 25th in St. Louis, and it's going to be 4 tracks. I've partnered with Todd Uri from the Podcast Network, and we have different track chairs for each topic. And the topic is going to be business growth and alternative revenue streams, compounding, of course, cannabis, and pharmacogenomics. So I hope everybody is interested in it. The Pharmasalon mentality is that we are more discussion-based and less didactic learning. Now, I know that the PowerPoint presentations are very important, and that's the best way to get CE credits. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be uploading all the PowerPoints and all the CEs, and you'll have full access to those over the month of October. And then that will leave the 24th and 25th just for exclusively for discussions. So we'll have a mixture of roundtables, fireside chats, and panel discussions. So I hope everybody will register. To get more information, go to pharmasalon.com/RX influencer. And of course, you can always reach out to me for more information. And of course, it's listed on our event page. Anyway, that's my pitch for the moment. Now I'm going to hand it over to Abby so we can talk about SOPs. And this is the third part in our series on SOPs. So Abby, why don't you let us know what we're focusing in on today?
Hi. So thanks for having me again, Vivian. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Abby Roth. I'm the owner of Pure Microbiology and have a background in pharmaceutical microbiology, specifically as it kind of relates to sterile compounding. But that also kind of gave me an opportunity to have a background in quality, as I was a quality director at a lab for a while. So it's kind of where we landed on talking about SOPs. And the last 2 weeks that we had these discussions about SOPs, we were kind of talking about the general, like, hey, these are the usual issues, and kind of also got into how you can make it a little bit easier on yourself to implement, update, create SOPs, getting templates, thinking about work instructions, and kind of blending all of that together. But one of the things that I think that we hadn't really talked about, Vivian, was really getting into some of the weird reasons why people kind of get nailed for SOP issues when it comes to the FDA or their state board inspectors or things like that. So that's kind of really more what I was thinking that we would talk a little bit about today.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my first questions is, besides the FDA's typical concern of noncompliance with written procedures, the SOP is not followed, you fail to
Yeah.
comply with your SOP, or insufficient procedures, i.e., your SOP is inadequate, or it fails to blah, 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 which would also be stated by the pharmacy concerns. What other SOP related concerns have you seen?
Yeah, so I mean, all of those are the general ones. You see those in the FDA 483s, and it's the typical stuff that the state boards would be worried about as well. But there are some other things that are SOP related, but aren't like super blatant that it's like, hey, you failed to follow an SOP. The first one is that the firm's quality control unit like failed to approve procedures. So that's a huge problem where you have something in place, everybody's following it, but it never went through any kind of formal approval process. So it is really important that you have some way documented in an SOP somewhere on how to actually approve all of your SOPs and say that it got reviewed by the people who need to review it. It's appropriate for use, and it's been moved to being the official SOP for that particular procedure. Um, One of the other ones would be that the SOP revisions themselves were really not performed or documented appropriately. And that probably seems also like a strange one. Um, but what will sometimes happen is you might end up going through the process of revising an SOP and not taking the all of the old versions out of circulation. Because if you're a paper-based system and people have access to different paper-based options, that could potentially be a problem. So you really want to make sure you have good control over where your paper-based SOPs are stored, who accesses them, and how they can be photocopied, and how you ensure that if you do have any floating around, that you can get those paper-based copies out of circulation so the appropriate SOPs are being followed. Not to mention then having a really good change control process in place to say that this SOP was updated, revised, here's the new, version of it, and this is what they're supposed to be using.
Now, I know last time I talked to somebody about revising SOPs, it had to do with staff shortages. And, when you have to change things around because you don't have enough people, or just in the labs and things like that.
Hmm.
So is that what you're seeing where people are they things happening? First of all, do you see people making those addendums or those revisions based on a fluctuating workforce? And is that where you're seeing the problems of they kind of will make a revision on how to deal with it? And I'm not sure if it happens daily or like how that would work in terms of one day you might have everybody in place, and then other day somebody might be sick, so you're short, so you have to have another SOP for the staff shortages. But then again, is that where you're seeing maybe not all the paperwork that you just mentioned is been revised or changed or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, that definitely could be an instance for that. And it's interesting that you bring that up because one of the things that I found interesting coming from the lab to the sterile compounding world is that in the lab and even with the manufacturing experience that I have, we could write up like deviations, like planned deviations from our SOPs, knowing that on a particular day, week, month, whatever, we're going to be short staffed and we have to make a modification until whatever date. And sometimes those deviations can be left open for a long period of time, especially if it's planned. Now,
Mhm,
obviously, if it's extensive, you'd want to make sure that you do finally update an SOP. But that's really an interesting conversation that you had because I haven't come across anybody that has specifically mentioned that yet. But that would be a major concern with staff shortages and then having to modify procedure when ultimately you're probably going to revert back to what had been in place. So, that's an interesting concept for pharmacy to introduce the ability to have a planned deviation from an SOP. You still have to make sure everybody's aware of that planned
mhm,
deviation. But once it's done, you kind of write it up, it's over, and you move back on. The flip side of that, Vivian, the other option is updating an SOP to accommodate for shortages, but still keep the main functionality of normal circumstance in the
mhm.
SOP. So, I mean, there's two
Right.
different ways to deal with that, but that's really interesting conversation that you did have.
Okay, great. And I want to remind everybody, if you have any thoughts on this, please type it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, I interrupted you. Did you have enough next thing to go on to?
The only other one that just has to be made sure that they are like dating the approval of the SOPs. Like, yeah, you're signing off that it was done, but make sure that there's an effective date that goes along with when that SOP actually takes effect.
Okay. Um, a lot of stuff that you talk about is quality related. Have you seen training related SOP concerns?
There have been some things that are training related to SOPs. Usually, like it's along the lines of something where, like, hey, there's no records in place to show that training specific to an employee's duties was performed as required by your SOP. So, if you're putting it in your SOP, how you are going to maintain training records, which you should, you have to make sure that you're following that. One of the other interesting things that I've come across in an audit was that managers of where I was auditing had no idea that certain SOPs existed. So that's a really, really scary issue there where if there's an SOP, everybody needs to know that it exists and needs to be following it. So that's also important. And then making sure that you are establishing like time frames and completion dates for your training related to the SOPs. And again, being in the lab, there were times where, and we were guilty of this for sure, we'd start training somebody on something, we'd start the documentation, and man, their training for something would just stay open for like 6, 8 months because we never got around to kind of finishing the training. Other stuff came up, they were doing other work. And it kind of looks terrible on the training record to say you started something and never followed through and finished completion. And one of the things that I have seen auditors look for is that you've established how long general training for something should take, and you get that kind of closed out for that particular individual. And again, something that's being put in your SOPs. This is the general time frame, and then following that. So
Okay.
the one other
What are,
crazy one that I wanted to
Mhm.
share, though, is that I have seen, and this was very common in some of the training that I've done, is where you have your SOPs in English, but you have maybe the environmental services staff or somebody else that does some kind of contract work for you that maybe can't read English. That's not their first language. And being sure that they're able to be trained on those SOPs and have the understanding needed. So that's actually come up for me in 2 training sessions where we came in to train in English. And in one case, I think Mandarin was the first language of the people that were in the training, and then Spanish. So that's, again, something you have to consider with your SOPs and training as well.
So examine your contractors
Yeah.
and the language. That's interesting. I can see how that would slip through the cracks. What are some ways organizations can simplify SOPs and make them more user friendly?
Yeah, well, that's what we're all looking for, I think, because if they're user friendly, hopefully people are following them, right? Um, I mean, one of the things to do is just avoid, you know, having a ton of detail in them. And the idea is, if there's a whole bunch of procedures that you could lump all together in one SOP, and then the SOP is 30 pages long. We talked about this. Nobody is going to want to follow that. So maybe splitting them out into things that are a little bit easier to kind of follow, more digestible chunks. That's one way to kind of avoid the, hey, procedures are not fully followed. Well, if you make them a little bit easier to understand, that's going to help. I also think too, like, re-engineering your procedures kind of as you go. And maybe you have the ability for a pharmacy technician or a pharmacist to start redlining a procedure while they're in the field. Because who knows, you could have something that you continually have issues with over and over and over again. You're finally getting to the point where it's like, man, we have to fix this now. um, have somebody in the field redline as they're doing the process. That will kind of help so that they can streamline some of the stuff that you're maybe no longer doing. um, and then look to keep things, like I said, as simple as possible. I love the idea of putting drawings, pictures, any kind of images in the SOPs that can kind of help with that clarity. And I like to equate that to, like, think about the IKEA instructions, right? You have an entire set of instructions with no words. Now, that's a little extreme for compounding, but it's kind of the idea here is that if you can give some good pictures or some good graphics, it will definitely, help out with that kind of thing. And then the last thing for me is just make sure that you are involving staff on multiple levels, because if it's an SOP that affects technicians, pharmacists, your management, whoever, make sure that they're all involved on that drafting and revision of that SOP so that it's going to be understandable by everybody.
All right, great. I think that about wraps us up. That about wraps us up at our 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? I'm going to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. I just want to one more note on the conference. Abby is going to be there talking about SOPs. We're going to be doing a workshop. So you are welcome to bring your SOPs and go over them. It's going to be a 2-hour workshop, and I think it'll be really great to, just have that hands-on training. Oh, we have a question. What kind of OMS system you use currently? I'm still on manual approach currently and would really appreciate your input and some good OMS software.
Um, so I don't have anything specific that I'm using just because I'm not in the field. I know a lot of the sterile compounders will use something like Simplify 797, and there's some other like pharmacy specific programs out there that kind of encompass all of your needs as far as that goes. One general good quality system that you could consider would be master control. And that really gives you total kind of control over who touches which documents, who can make revisions, all of that. So I have some familiarity with that particular system. So if you're looking for something just for like document and quality management control, that could help.
Okay, another question. Can you comment on attachments to SOPs?
I'm okay with attachments to SOPs, kind of thinking them as like, appendices or something like that. You just want to be careful that they're referenced within the SOP and that the users know that they are going to need to you know, seek out those particular documents. So make sure
Yep.
that that SOP references, as you're saying there, the forms, the work instructions, the lists, the logs, whatever those happen to be. I do like to make sure that everything obviously is numbered, all of your forms, work instructions, lists, so that you can keep track of everything. But yeah, you can definitely link them to the SOPs, and it makes sense to do that.
Okay, excellent. All right, that about wraps us up. Thank you very much, Abby. A pleasure as always.
All right.
And well, I'm sure we'll talk again soon. If
Yep.
not, I'll
Thanks.
see you in October.
Yes. Thanks, Vivian.
All right, have a good day.
All right.
Bye.
You too. Bye.